Welcome back to Homegrown Presents. We're excited to have you join us as we discover new practices our agriculture community is utilizing to enhance their operations.
I'm Jared Quested. I'm from Baltic, South Dakota. So what we do on our farm, we farm corn and soybeans, and we have a small feedlot where we feed background cattle. We homesteaded a few miles south of here in 1886, and we've been farming most of our land since then. I've been part of the farm as long as I can remember, I guess, but when I came home from tech school in 2012, I had some different ideas how I wanted to do things, and we've been starting in no-till now on our third year on most pieces, and excited to continue on with that. It's just one of those things that the more you do it, I think the more we'll see the benefit. You know, the first year we tried it on a couple pieces and just, went in and kind of tried to figure it out and had to adapt the planter a little bit that first year to do some things. And the next year we decided to do just about all of it into no-till, and we had to do a lot of adaptation to the planter to make everything kind of run through like we wanted it to. So, once we got going, it was pretty simple, and then we found, the amount of man hours it didn't take for, running a tillage tractor all day, or, just all the fuel that we would have burned, that way too. It just simplified our lives quite a bit to be able to do the no-till. The second year when I started telling people like, oh, I think, we're just gonna go ahead and leave the disc unhooked and just go ahead and plant fields. And that's when guys were like, are you sure you wanna do that? How much yield do you think you're gonna give up? And, a lot of these questions come around, and my basic answer was, well, I don't really know, but I'm pretty certain this is gonna be the right way to go, just because there's a lot of good history around the area, the people that are doing it that seem to be quite successful. We got hills and, valleys and all things like that. Probably that's part of the reason when I started really seeing the benefit was, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, we had a really heavy rain, and we just got done tilling, and we had all kinds of washouts and, all kinds of erosion. And it's like, that takes forever to get that back to where it should be. So right after that is like, we got to do something different. So now we've stopped disking all these low spots, that are highly erodible. The low spots aren't so bad, but going up into the hills and such like that, we just leave that alone. We can just farm through them rather than having to till them up and have all the washing happen again. You see that these fields that are all tilled up and everything, there's just no structure to the soil anymore. It's just completely just falls apart. So when we get those big washing rains, we can see why that happens. Whereas these fields with higher organic matter and better soil structure from the no-till, when you get heavy rains, rather than it washing away, it catches more through the organic matter, and then it'll go down into the soil where we actually need it. Since we do have the feedlot, we had a lot of manure that we were disking in yet, because that seemed to be the only way to do it, but it's kind of one of those things that you learn to do the application a little bit different, and you might be able to have some different success with no-till with that. So this year we have right about 100 and some acres that we're gonna have manure spread over lightly, and then we're gonna no-till right into that. With the no-till situation, I think the benefit is to towns that are downstream is that maybe more of our nutrients that they're afraid are getting into streams are being absorbed into the soil and being used by crops rather than being washed away, which makes it more economical for us, because then all that money we spend on fertilizer is where we put it, not washing down somewhere else. And so I think there's benefit to just about everybody by using no-till. After you spend a little time getting adjusted, I think all that yield that you might lose the first couple of years will come right back to you. You're gonna save money on the fuel, you're gonna save money with the fertilizer, because that's staying where you put it. And through all these different practices, you're probably saving quite a bit of money, but then long run, you're gaining yield because you're increasing the value of the land. Once you get all the good things going, you still got to preserve the land. And if you preserve the land, that's going to help you produce more than anything. So generations to come, hopefully our land is worth more than it was now when I'm starting. I guess to encourage other producers to try it, You just got to get out there and start doing it and put the disc away and just realize the amount of time you're going to save and the amount of labor you're going to save. But then in a couple years, when you start seeing that soil structure change, then you're going to really be happy you did. So, I mean, there's no reason to wait any longer.
After the break, the South Dakota Stock Growers Association will show us how Jorgensen Land and Cattle isn't afraid to introduce new concepts and technologies into their business.
I'm one of 4 partners and 3rd generation of 5 on the ground, going back to 1909 when my grandfather and grandmother settled here. And so the business has been in our family for over 110 years, so we're pretty proud of that.
We farm about 13,000 acres. We have 1,000 mother cows, and we also have a commercial pheasant hunting operation. Probably the biggest part of our operation is that we're in the Black Angus bull business. We'll merchandise just a handful over 4,000 Black Angus bulls in an annual basis.
We're running a farm and ranch here. It's a family-owned business. We've got a long legacy. There's a lot of that, you know, the heritage stuff, and we do what we do philosophically to improve the soil, you know, do right by the cattle, do right by the people that work for us. But kind of where I come in is we're running a business, right? And when you run a business, to stay in business, you have to make money. And so ultimately, a lot of the decisions we make, nearly all the decisions we make, you know, kind of come across my desk where we kind of analyze profitability-wise. You know, does this make sense for us to do? Or are we further ahead by doing this? Are we worse off by doing this?
We've always been taught to be diverse in whatever we do, and how we think and what we grow and what we market. We've always been taught to be diverse. We've always been taught to be forward thinking, to think outside the box, to try things that may or may not work, to not be afraid to fail, but learn from those failures. And I think it's because of those installations that our parents and grandparents put into us is why we are where we are today.
When I think about inputs, you know, I'll talk a little bit maybe about like the crop ground, the cover crops and stuff. That one's pretty cut and dry. You know, we can track our costs pretty well, and you can tell the marginal differences, the decisions that we make, and those are easy decisions. You know, it didn't make sense for us to spend that $30 an acre. Usually it does, you know, when you're talking about cover crops. That's easy to analyze. You know, where things get a little bit tougher probably is like when we're starting to analyze rotational grazing, you know, the additional people it takes, you know, where's the break even there, just because you kind of get into a messy pool of people and a messy pool of time. But the general rule that I guess I've gone off of when I think about the rotational grazing specifically is looking at the grass. You know, we've been doing this for 4 years. How does our rangeland look? And you know, from there, you analyze it. I look at it like we're building in insurance. We're managing our cows like we would as far as numbers wise, and the costs that we look at it wise as if we weren't rotationally grazing, and we're paying for an insurance policy. And we have not changed our stocking rates at all. You know, it's generally like, you know, 8 acres to a cow. Could we push that lower? We absolutely could. You know, I'm confident we could get down 5 or 6 acres, but we don't. And that's our drought plan. So you think about it, we're building forage. We've got an extra, you know, what do you want to call it, 3 acres per cow of forage. So the year it doesn't rain and we don't have grass, or the year that the grass grows slower, we've protected ourselves, in my opinion.
The native prairies that we used to just turn cattle out and let them graze in big pastures, it seemed like we would just control the movements just based on you know, a visual appraisal. And now with an actual grazing plan that is structured and set up, we're moving often, moving early, right? And so the second time they get to hit that grass, you're seeing the grass look better than it did when you first turned out on it. Your native grasses, honestly, before we didn't even look at it. You looked at what was out there, forage, you say, yeah, that looks good, whether it was brome or we didn't even interpret the different species. We didn't understand it. Now we do. Now we look at it. Now we care about it. Now we're trying to mimic it. Now we're trying to propagate it. And we're starting to see some changes. Really, this is the fourth season of a structured grazing plan that we've implemented. And so we're just now starting to see some pretty serious results.
If you're trying to tell somebody, how do I do this? How do I start this? Go find yourself a nice piece of native prairie. Take a spade with you and just dig up the soil and look at what Mother Nature's capacity is. And observe the vegetation that's there. Observe the topography. Observe all that's there to observe. And spend some time. Look at the insects that are there. Look at the soil structure. Look at the roots. Look at the plants. Look at the landscape. Look at the wildlife that are out there. And all those things will start telling you stories of how this system is really supposed to work. And if you can take some of that information back and start putting it into your management practices, it's really no more complicated than that. You have to learn how to step outside the box. You have to be not afraid to make mistakes. You have to take chances. You have to step outside of that old paradigm and start thinking like Mother Nature thinks, rather than what the banker thinks, or the farm service agency thinks, or the insurance agency thinks. You've got to start thinking about how Mother Nature thinks. And I really think that's key.
So this year, we got involved with a company called Vents. They're out of California, and they build GPS collars to put on cattle. They're a collar that you strap around the neck, and it functions really as, if you're familiar with GPS geofencing collars for dogs. It's very similar, just a larger version. And so what we did this year was, at breeding time, we selected a group of cows, specifically it was actually our heifers, that we put these collars on, put them around their neck after we bred them, and then we used it to manage them rotationally. So we've got this battery-powered, GPS-guided collar that's on the animal. We had to go around to certain parts of our property and put up some radio tower base stations, because that's how they communicate between the collar and the internet, where we're making the paddocks and the grazing schedules and things like that. So we built these towers in some strategic locations, and we looked at the area they were at, and you literally just on your computer you draw a pen, you draw a pasture inside of a pasture, and those collars will keep the animal where you tell it to go. It was an interesting learning experience. We had a couple things we could have done differently, for sure, on our end. Probably didn't put them on as well as we were supposed to. It was the first year, we're testing this deal out, but it worked phenomenally well. And we had a debrief call here a few weeks ago with Vince, where we talked about the grazing experiment over the summer on the heifers. And in general, we had about 85% containment. So you think about that for a second. Like I mentioned, we put them on wrong. So that means we had some animals that didn't have a collar on them at all. And so when you think about animals that are being managed with the collar on their neck, right? There's something they can't see telling them that they can't go somewhere, right? And then there were others that weren't, and cattle are herd animals. And so when there's a group of heifers over here that can't go somewhere because they're getting beeped at and zapped, there's another group of heifers over here that aren't having that pressure. It creates a little confusion for those animals. So despite all that, we still were managed to contain 85% of those collared animals. Additionally, we had a lot of collars that flipped and weren't stimulating them. And so still, 85% containment just indicates that herd pressure has some really good effects for us. And when you think about it from an economic perspective, we basically just, I mean, listen, you're never gonna contain 100% of your cows, even with a fence, right? You know, you're gonna have ones get out. You know, but for us, we can comparably, financially, put a collar on these animals and graze them in places where we don't have fence. We can do it way cheaper than if we were to go out there and build a fence around, you know, say a section of ground. What does 4 miles of fence cost? It's gonna cost you almost $30,000 probably. We can graze animals, you know, out on a section with no fence for a lot less than that. You're talking probably 4 figures instead of 5. We were able to rotationally graze these cattle. We took a 100-acre field, split it into 3 30s, and it worked. I mean, we grazed them in this paddock for 3 days. We moved the fence over here, and the cows naturally moved themselves into the next one, couldn't get to the first one, and we rotated through. From an efficiency perspective, and you know, not to get too deep into details, but you can get into a system like this for less than $50 a collar a year. And you think about like your fencing costs on any operation, right? You know, if you've got good fence already around a lot of property that's in good shape and doesn't need a lot of fixing, you know, maybe there's some analysis that needs to be done there to see whether a technology like this makes sense. But where I look at it is you have a lot of property that say maybe you put up electric wire around or poly wire around, or you have good big pastures, you know, sections or 5 or 1,000 acre pastures that aren't cross fenced, and you want to try and rotationally graze. You're faced with either going out there, putting up permanent fence, running poly wire, which if you're familiar with, you know, single strand electric or poly wire, it works, but it's a pain in the butt. You know, it's just a lot of manual labor. Or you're faced with using a product like this where you got a collar on that animal, you know where that animal is at all times, you know how it's been behaving over, you know, whatever period you want to study. And if you want to move them every day, you can do that, and you don't have to physically be out there, you know, on that Saturday and on that Sunday, moving that group of animals. And so from a cost perspective, you know, there's places that make sense and there's places that it doesn't. For us, where we're gonna see the benefit is on crop ground where we don't have fence, or big pastures like we saw this morning, that we just don't have the time and ability to cross fence, to be able to hone those animals in on a certain area that maybe doesn't get enough pressure. We can do that now. And we can do it without, you know, causing an immense amount of stress to these animals. You know, it only stimulates them when they're moving towards what is keeping them in, right? So what we did with these animals was we put them in, let's just say it was 200 head. Put them in a 40-acre paddock with a real fence around the whole thing. They had fence around the whole pasture they were in. And you build the geofence just inside of it. So they have this collar on, and it gives them sound stimulus first, and then if they get too close to the real fence, it gives them electric stimulus. And so what they see is they hear a beep as they're walking towards a fence. They get a small shock, and I've seen them get shocked. I mean, it's no worse than an electric cattle prod. As a matter of fact, they react a lot milder to these collars than to a cattle prod. And when they get shocked, the only option they have is to turn around and go the other way, right? Because they got a real fence there stopping them. And so you've trained them. When they hear that sound, eventually they're gonna know, all right, I'm gonna hear this sound, in a few seconds I'm gonna get hurt. So I'm gonna turn around, because that's what they learn to do, is they learn to go the other way. So after 4 or 5 days of that, you can put them in a paddock with literally no fence at all, none. And they will learn when they hear those sounds, hey, I need to go the other direction. And it worked really well for us. What we found was they spend a lot of time testing that boundary. You know, just like any 4-legged animal will, you know, they're gonna test that fence. They always will. And so, you know, we learned they really like to hang around the edges, right where they could hear that beep, but they knew they weren't gonna get any negative stimulus, but it would keep them in. And we learned some interesting things like, you know, maybe you didn't know this, but I didn't. Cows go to roost at night. They roost in the same place every chance that they can. And I'd never thought about this until we were looking at our maps, right? So with these collars on, it tracks their movement, tells us where they were over the last 7, 14, 30 days or 12 hours. And what we were seeing was on 200 collars during the day, the animals are spread out. There's little dots all over the map in the paddock all day long. And then at night, it went like this. and it was to the same spot every single night. In the first rotationally grazed paddock, they went to the same spot every night. When we moved them to paddock 2, which was, we moved their roost, they roosted absolutely as close to that original spot as they could. Right along the edge of the fence, right as close to it as they could get. And when we moved them to paddock 3, which was a quarter mile from their original roost, you know how I told you that we contained 85% of those animals with the collar? In paddock 3, it was 50. Because at night, they took the shock so they could go sleep in the same spot. You get some animals that get out, they're gonna go do their own thing. You know, maybe they've learned to not really care about the little zap they're getting. They'll go do their own thing, but they always wanna get back with their friends, right? And so that's why it's having a couple animals get out is not a problem, because if 1 or 2 or 3 are out, they're eventually gonna say, hey, I wanna get back with the rest of the herd, and they go recontain themselves by walking back through the geofence. So it kind of functions like a check valve, if you will, you know, where things can go in one way without any problem, and they have a hard time going the other way. It's extremely exciting for me, you know, for the concept that, you know, maybe someday we'll have 1,000 cows out, you know, with collars on them. And right now in our rotational grazing system, you know, we try and logistically make things easier than you probably would in an authentic, intense rotational grazing system. You know, we don't move cows Saturdays, Sundays, because we don't want our people having to be out there doing that on the weekend. We space the moves out a little more because we're managing 5 groups of cows, and it's just difficult. You know, it'd be impossible for us without having a 5 or 10 man crew to be out there moving these cows and checking the grass and all that as often as we should be. But maybe now with technology like this, where it can kind of be built into the plan, if you will, into the schedule, you know, maybe our guys will get more time to, you know, get a little more intimate with the grass and get a little bit more intimate with an individual group of cows or a location, things like that.
Anytime you get more intimate with your cattle on a personal level, things seem to go better. Calving seems to go better. It seems that you just have less issues with the cattle once the cattle are used to the intimacy, right? So there's a lot of positives that you don't really think about when you enter into an endeavor like an intensive rotational grazing system. You just don't recognize some of these things, and that is one of them. Obviously, the internal parasite controller is one big one, and then the cattle intimacy, I'd say, would be the second one that comes that we didn't recognize or didn't plan on.
Start on a small scale and break off a small portion of those cows or whatever, and do a micro herd in a very small, because everything that we're doing here is scalable. Everything that we're doing on 1 acre, we can do on 10,000 or 20,000 or 50,000 acres. We can do that incrementally if we have the resources to do that. But you have to learn how to do it on the 1 acre first, efficiently.